Hello and welcome to this next video on basic electrical repairing. So far we've tried to understand different types of tools that are used in the electrical repairing work. In this video we will try and understand the difference between insulator and conductor. Conductors and insulators are essential elements that you must be familiar with while you're working with electrical, and in order to help you understand that, we are going to take you through some of the common consumables that you will be using while working in the electrical trade. You can see these consumables in the screen now. There are wires kept there are some covers, some paper rolls which are kept here. So using these, we will try and understand what a conductor and an insulator. A conductor is essentially a component which allows electricity to pass through it, whereas an insulator is something that does not allow the current to pass through it. So some of the consumables that you see here in front of you are actually conductors and insulators. Let's take the case of this plier. So the plier has a conductor in the tip. The metal part that you see is a conductor which can conduct electricity, and the bottom part is actually the insulator. This is a polyvinyl chloride insulator which does not allow the current to pass through, and therefore when you hold it you will not feel an electric shock because this insulator prevents the passage of electricity from the tip to your hands. So most of these tools that you use, like the cutter or the plier or the long nose plier, typically have an insulator covering on it which will prevent the current from passing through from the metal point to your hand. It is the same thing with all the wires as well. Even in the wires you will see a PVC covering for all the wires, and inside the PVC covering is where the actual wire is. So the wire inside is actually a conductor of electricity, whereas the cover or the insulator that you have outside is something that prevents the electricity to be transferred, or it does not conduct electricity. As a result, when you hold this wire, even if there is electricity passing through in the inside wire, you will not feel a shock in your hand. Now there are different types of wires. So let's try and understand some of the common wires that are used. So the first one that we saw, the yellow color one, is actually called a 118 wire. Now typically wires are classified based on their gauges and the number of cores that it has. A 118 wire basically means that it has a single core. As you can see, there's only one wire that's jutting out of it, and 18 signifies the thickness of the wire, which is measured in the form of a gauge. You can use a standard wire gauge, a small tool which is in a circular format, to measure the gauge of these wires. So a 118 basically means this wire has one core or one single wire jutting out, which is of a gauge of 18. Now this is a different type of wire. This is called a multi-wire. A multi-wire basically has small wires, a lot of small wires in it. As you can see very closely, the tip has multiple wires which are inside it, and it's covered by a PVC insulator. The reason why we use multi-wire these days is because it's very flexible and you can use it in multiple positions, locations, unlike a single core wire. So in a typical multi-wire, you will see many wires jutting out. In multi-wires, the thickness is measured in the form of millimeters. So you can get wires of multiple thicknesses, and depending on the requirement, you can choose different multi-wires. For example, the green one is a 1.5 mm wire, whereas the black one is a 1 mm wire. So you have 1 mm, 1.5 mm, and then there is a 2 millimeter wire as well. So depending on the requirement, you use different types of wires or different thickness of wires. And you can see the thickness of the wires also. So the 1 mm black one is slightly thinner than the 1.5 mm green wire. So the thickness and the quantity of wires will also differ depending on the size of the wire. So this wire is actually a 2 mm wire. The red color one is a 2 mm wire. It's even more thicker than the 1.5 or 1 mm wire, and you can see the thickness very clearly. The thickness of the wire determines the capacity for a wire to take the load. For example, something like a geyser or voltage stabilizers will probably require a higher thickness wire. For example, an AC might require a 4 mm wire, because the higher the thickness, the higher the ability for the wire to take on heat. And if you use a thinner wire where the load is high, the wire might melt due to the excessive heat generated by the electricity. Hence, it is important to identify the right thickness of wire for the right equipment in order to ensure that there is safe electric supply across points in the house or even for the equipment. Another type of wire is a typical multi-core wire. This is a 7-core wire. You would typically see 7 individual wires jutting out from this. So this wire is called 720. The reason why we call it is 720 is because there are 7 different cores, and the gauge or the thickness of each of these wires is actually 20, and that's the reason why this is called a 720 wire. So you can see clearly you can see the differences. Now among these wires, there is no the quality or the reason to use a wire is dependent on what you are going to be using the wire for. Is it for heavy equipments or is it for lighter equipments? That should help you determine what thickness you should be using. So a typical 7-core wire, when they combine together jointly, the thickness becomes very high, and that will ensure that it is able to withstand the necessity to pass electricity for heavy appliances. Now let's try and open another insulator in one of the wires to see what kind of wire this is. You can do this using the combination plier. You can use a tool called stripper or a wire stripper that can be used to strip off the insulation part of the wire. Now, while you are removing the insulation part, just be careful that you don't cut off the wire while you are doing this. Now we have removed the insulation, and you can clearly see how many cores are there. So there are three wires here. So this is 3-core, and each of them is around 18. The gauge is around 18. So this is a 318 wire. So the wire's thickness is very good. So typically these kind of wires, such as the 318 ones, are used for heavy lines or equipments that require heavy electric supply. Apart from these, is another type of wire called a flexible wire. Flexible wire typically has 2 wires intertwined with each other. A very lightweight, very light, cannot be used for high voltage equipments. This is typically used for connecting a tube light or maybe the fan and so on. Any equipment that requires very less load can be used connected using the flexible wire. This is flexible and is very easy to get intertwined into smaller locations. Apart from this, this is another type of wire. So it's called a cable wire. This is a 3-core cable which typically has 3 different points. In this case, you see these 3 different points, and in these points you can connect equipments which require heavy electricity. So the wires are for specific reasons. The red is for the phase, black is for the neutral, and green is for the earthing. So any equipments that require heavy load with earthing requires the 3 type of coil. Apart from the wires, the quality or the material with which wires are made are also important. Most wires are either made of aluminum and copper. Copper wires are typically slightly more expensive compared to the aluminum wires, but aluminum wires are also used in many places. The reason why an aluminum wire is better is because it does not get rust, water or any of that will not have any impact on the quality of the aluminum wire. A copper wire is far better in terms of conducting electricity. So it depends on whether you want to spend the kind of money on a copper wire. You can see the difference there. The green one is the copper wire and the blue one is the aluminum wire. Typically the aluminum wires don't take too much load, whereas copper wires can withstand heavy loads. So there are advantages and disadvantages. So typically when you need to use aluminum for heavy equipments, we use wires with multiple aluminum wires within to increase the thickness and the ability to conduct high level of electricity. So apart from these, one other important wire that is used is the wire that's used for service line or to connect from the electricity pole to your mains. So service lines also typically use many a times use aluminum core. Because the thickness of the aluminum core in these wires are very high, they will be able to conduct high levels of electricity. And at this level of thickness, copper wires can be very expensive, and that's the reason why aluminum wires are used in many places. You can very clearly see there are two leads here, one for the phase and one for neutral. And most of these wires will also have an earthing cable also inside it, which will ensure that the electricity is earthed, the connection is earthed properly. So in outside weather conditions, aluminum wires are much better because they don't have carbon depositing on it, and they are far more stronger as well than copper wires, and those are the reasons why aluminum wires are preferred for any outside connections which are open to the vagaries of nature. One last wire that you will also notice is this roll of wire. This is called an insulated wire or enameled wire. It's also called magnet wire. Now these wires, although they look bare, they have a coating of enamel on top of it, which acts as an insulator for each of these wires. Just as you have PVC insulators on these, there are very minute insulators that are coated on top of these wires. These insulators are usually made of zinc or sometimes polyurethane or polyvinyl and several other substances that act as good insulators. These are used in motor winding, where the wire is wound very closely to each other, and you don't want any of those wires to come in contact with each other because that could result in short circuit. So they are coated very finely with one of these coating substances, ensuring that they are insulated properly. And in order to remove the insulation, you can try multiple things. One option is to use the tip of a soldering iron to actually remove the insulation and then solder it whenever you want to solder it in specific locations. So in this video, we tried to understand some of the conductors and insulators, and particularly types of wires and how you can identify which wire is what using a visual inspection of these wires. Going forward, in the next video, we will try and understand a little more about insulators. Thank you.